صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم.
Assalamu alaikum. Many peace and blessings be upon you all. My name is Anam Iqbal and I will be your host for today. This podcast is brought to you by Minhaj Welfare Foundation, who have been active since 1989 in providing humanitarian resources to people throughout the world. In particular, they provide food, educational resources, and many other aspects of social welfare to people throughout the third world. If we have a look at this podcast, Muhammad the Humanitarian, it has been inspired by the legacy of Muhammad, the legacy which is instilled within Minhaj Welfare Foundation and the very core value that has been inspiring them to carry out such humanitarian work. If you wish to see the incredible humanitarian work that Minhaj Welfare Foundation have been consistently doing for many years now, please check out minhajwelfare.org. You can also submit your donations via the site. This podcast was created to shed light on the humanitarian perspective of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. In order to celebrate his incredible humanitarian legacy and his message, Minhaj Welfare are currently carrying out a Mawlid package, which will specifically deliver clean water and cooked meals to people throughout the third world. Again, please visit minhajwelfare.org in order to see more about their work. Our special guest for today is Dr. Craig Considine. He is a scholar, a professor, a global speaker, and a public intellectual based at the Department of Sociology in the University of Rice. He is also an interfaith activist who works to build bridges between people of different faiths as a means of promoting deeper understanding, connection, respect, love, and communication. Hi, Craig. Thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
I feel like it's being handed over to me, but unfortunately, I can't hear our host.
Oh, okay. Our team,
and I think we're trying to resolve the issue at the moment in the comments section, but I think we can still manage to pull this off, even though it probably wouldn't be easy, but I feel like we might be able to do it. And I'm sure you just gave me a really nice introduction, so I want to thank you for that. It's great to be with you all today. Thank you to Minhaj for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. So the first matter that I'd like to talk about, or I think that you asked me to talk about, is like the background of the book and kind of what motivated me
I think we are having a technical issue at the moment. Our team should be on it in the background, trying to sort things out. I will just give you a little bit of an overview of what Dr. Considine was just talking about. So he has written a book on Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that was published in September 2020. It's called The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View. So belonging to the Christian faith, Dr. Considine decided to actually focus on Prophet Muhammad's legacy, his teachings, and his humanitarian work. And this was quite unique to some people, who thought it to be rather strange that somebody of the Christian faith is devoting so much of his time, his knowledge, his academic excellence to promoting the legacy of Prophet Muhammad and to speak about his teachings and to tackle and defend against any defamation. Hi, Dr. Considine. I was just giving a bit of a background.
I still can't hear you, but
okay.
Okay. I'm going to continue with the summary, the inspiration. Okay. So, when I started studying Christian-Muslim relations, the Islamic faith, it was actually around 2003 when the invasion of Iraq happened. And I talk about this in my book, and I actually go even further back in the book to 9/11 and the impact that had on me, but I'm trying to condense. So the invasion of Iraq in 2003 really bothered me, and I sensed that there was something really fundamentally wrong happening. And it didn't have to do with 9/11. It had to do with the demonization of an entire religion and groups of people who are associated with this religion, and indeed nations. This depiction of Iraqis as radical Muslims, as somehow barbaric, all of these things that were really fed to the American people, I knew something was wrong. And I wanted to get into politics and international relations, understand why this boogeyman was created. And I quickly found out, after sitting in a couple of courses at American University, that the Islamic faith, the Islamic tradition, its engagement with Christians throughout history was nothing like I saw in the media, and nothing like the depiction that politicians and other kind of religious leaders were painting. And really what kind of turned me on to this journey was knowledge. One of the first things I learned about the Islamic tradition via Professor Akbar Ahmed at American University were a couple of hadiths. And these hadiths had to do with the emphasis that Prophet Muhammad placed on knowledge. And for me, this entire journey really is one about this appreciation and this love for knowledge. And I seek out knowledge largely through the prism of Christian and Muslim relations, and I find inspiration in Prophet Muhammad and Muslims themselves and the Islamic faith. So really for me, I don't necessarily think I chose this path. There have been times in my life where I did make conscious decisions saying, I wanted to become a student and I wanted to write a book, but really for me, I'm a product of my environment and my time. I feel like I was a young man when 9/11 happened. A lot of impressionable things happened. And in 2000, I'll finish this little section with more of a direct reference to Prophet Muhammad. In 2013, I came across Dr. John Andrew Morrow's book on the covenants that Prophet Muhammad had entered with the Christians of his time. So 10 years after I first engaged in this kind of journey of knowledge, I finally came across, at least in an in-depth manner, Muhammad's relations with Christians. I really didn't know that much about it. I was focusing more on the kind of clash of civilizations and looking at politics and relations between people. And when I read Dr. Morrow's book, it was really a game changer, because I found so much material based on the historical sources on Muhammad's life and legacy. And I felt like it really resonated with me, and I needed to share it. As someone who is trying to spread knowledge, I felt almost obligated and duty bound to share this type of knowledge.
I think that aspect is really inspiring, especially since there are instances where people feel as though religions are mutually exclusive, almost as though they are not bound in any way. But in the way that you've written your book, it's clear to see that these legacies almost built upon one another, and there is so much similarity. And something that's profound about your work is that it focuses on creating bridges, and it focuses on historical instances which really highlight the compassion, the mercy of Prophet Muhammad, and how he believed in a religiously pluralistic society. And something that is incredible to read in your book is the aspect of the vision of Prophet Muhammad's ummah, and how it was steeped heavily in religious tolerance, especially if you look at cases where Christians within the time of the Prophet Muhammad were treated, how they were given freedom of expression, freedom to practice their faith. And I would like to ask you if you could shed maybe a little bit of light on these aspects which are prevalent throughout your book, on the humanitarian perspective of Prophet Muhammad, in particular his religious tolerance and the way he welcomed Christians and Jews.
Okay, perfect. So I see the question. Do you think we can learn from Prophet Muhammad's vision of the Ummah? Yes, absolutely. There's no question about that. And the book, I dedicate chapters to sociological themes that we see in our contemporary societies. So when we talk about things like anti-racism, when we talk about concepts like religious pluralism, or this idea of living in a civic nation, all of which are chapters in the book, we see an image of the Ummah that in many ways represents the best image of many so-called Western countries. Like we in the West, in the United States and in Western Europe, like we like to think of society as being egalitarian, as being open, as being rooted in democratic norms and democratic values. And what's interesting about the so-called West is that it wants a monopoly over these issues. But like when you go back into Prophet Muhammad's life and legacy, you learn that the Islamic tradition really not only has a strong link to some of these sociological concepts that I just mentioned, but it was literally the very foundation of the type of society that is this idealized, open, inclusive idea of not only what it means to be part of a Muslim community, but in general, how do we operate our societies? So yeah, there's no question about it. And unfortunately, people in Western countries and perhaps in Christian households, it's sad that people don't even want to potentially recognize the fact that the Islamic tradition has this history and has these roots. It's kind of quite unfortunate. And then I think when we flip it and we look at Muhammad's vision in comparison to what we see happening around Muslim majority countries today, I think there's a lot to question too. Like when we see the blatant persecution of Christians, and then you juxtapose that with Muhammad's life and legacy, and you kind of scratch your head and you say, well, how did we get here if we have such strong examples of coexistence?
I think you've touched upon some very, very important points there about the fact that Prophet Muhammad's vision of the Ummah was without doubt one of pluralism, religious tolerance, of compassion, of mercy. Time and time again, Prophet Muhammad proved through his own life and his own legacy that he was never willing to turn to violence, and he was never willing to persecute people because of their religious background, and he dealt with religious minorities with such peace and compassion. So this is definitely something to be questioned in Muslim majority countries. Why are they claiming to follow the teachings of Prophet Muhammad and yet going against the very basis, the very vision that was all to do with love for humanity, compassion, tolerance, pluralism, and connectivity? And this is something that I think we can really see through Dr. Considine's work, the way he actually ties together the Christian faith, the Islamic faith, and creates bridges for us to learn from each other, for us to work together. And we can see this from the time of Prophet Muhammad. There were many instances in which Prophet Muhammad showed that he believed truly in the fact that Christians have the right to worship, and even to the extent that he allowed them to worship within his own mosque, Al-Masjid al-Nabawi. The next question we would like to ask Dr. Considine is also linked onto his book, and it is to do with the term Islamic apologist. Within the book, he's described himself as an Islamic apologist, and we are interested to see what he means by this.
This is fun because I'm starting to read your lips a little bit. I could see at the end when you say, "What do you mean by this?" So yes, I've long considered myself to be an Islamic apologist, and it's largely because the Islamophobia industry used to label me as an Islamic apologist, and I was just like, I'm going to embrace this. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And they were painting me out to be, a deceiver and someone who has like an ulterior motive, and I'm working for this government and this intelligence agency. All of that is just, it's meaningless. It means nothing. Like personally, one of the reasons why I engage in apologetics, which is really rooted into Greek philosophy, it's a defense of something. And when I look at the Islamic tradition, faith, theology as a whole, I find a lot of similarities, being essentially part of the same religious tribe in many ways. Jews, Christians, and Muslims are monotheists. We're quite close. We have similar histories. We've operated in a smooth manner with each other through various points in history. We believe in many of the same prophets. So there's just so many things that I think are willing that I'm willing to defend theologically. But I think more importantly, especially when it comes to the life of Prophet Muhammad, like one of the reasons why I engage in this is because being a sociologist and being someone who genuinely enjoys cross-cultural interactions, actually engaging with people, I see Muhammad's life and legacy being played out in people's character and conduct today. Muslims who happen to be my friends, who have hosted me, who have welcomed me, who have helped me grow. All of these things that I'm really quite thankful for. And what I admire about these people are their principles, their ethics, their values, and they're inspired to act in certain ways because of their prophet. And I find that to be meaningful and powerful, not only as a Christian, but as a human being in general. So yeah, I'm certainly willing to defend things I believe, that I support, that I believe in.
I think it's incredibly important to also speak about all of these aspects in light of current events. We are living in a time of rampant Islamophobia, and we know that theologically there are so many similarities. We are all people who follow monotheism, as Dr. Considine just pointed out. However, in many ways, the Judeo-Christian elements, which are widespread throughout the Western world, have always set Islam a little bit apart, as though it is not compatible. And we see this in the way that Western society has media outlets that promote this division, and they try to highlight the differences, and they make it seem as though Muslim women or Muslims in general are not integrating. Their faith doesn't allow them to integrate. And so I guess the next question we need to ask Dr. Considine is, why is there such rampant Islamophobia if there are such similarities between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism?
That is one of the $1 million questions right there. Why is there all of this Islamophobia, even though we're so close theologically? I think there's many reasons. There's many answers to this question. I think the two that stick out the most would be lack of knowledge, which some people may refer to as ignorance. A lot of the people don't recognize or know about what these similarities are. And I think this is rooted in our educational systems. And when I say our, like I'm speaking from my context, being born and raised in a Catholic community in Boston in the United States, we never learned about anything outside of the Catholic faith. I didn't even learn about, Protestantism, a sect of Christianity that is really so close to Catholicism. And when people don't have exposure to knowledge, they go elsewhere to form their opinions. And I think in 2020, people largely go to the media, and the media is filled with politicians, controversial figures who give excellent sound bites, and really from people oftentimes who have ulterior motives. So this is a serious issue. I never learned about, even in public school, I didn't learn about Islamic history when we were talking about even something like Western civilization. Like when we look at Al-Andalus and the history of Muslim Spain, I mean, that's part of European history. We never even learned about that. So there's that. There's lack of knowledge, but it's also a lot deeper than that, unfortunately. And the two other terms that come to mind are fear and apathy. But I think these are closely related. Too many people don't care about Islamophobia. They don't care about anti-Muslim sentiment. And this is discouraging, and it's the sign of an unhealthy society, because Muslims are part of our communities. And, if one body of a given community is hurting, then there's something fundamentally wrong. There's something that is not constructive, and it's not productive. So we need to do a better job of kind of understanding why something like Islamophobia is a public problem. It's a not just a private issue that Muslims have to deal with. It's a public issue that is much bigger, really, than the discrimination of one group. It's almost like a systemic issue. And then I think the third point here is fear. Like people like to be fearful of things almost as a crutch sometime. Like they kind of just want to they dismiss things. They have a lack of interest, and I think fear is related to the previous point. With apathy. So those are the three issues that come to my mind.
I would like to steer the conversation in the direction of current events. And as we've seen, there is an increasing rampant fear of Muslims spread throughout France following the recent terrorist attack. And many people have said that the President Macron's approach has been quite Islamophobic and also dangerous in the sense that it will possibly increase Islamophobia, fear of Muslims, divisions within society, and also create polarization. And the fact that Muslims have been feeling the Islamophobia within the country for a while, this could actually promote more terrorism amongst some factions because they may not feel heard, they may feel misunderstood. I would like to ask Dr. Considine, what is his take on the current situation within France? Does he think that President Macron is handling it well? What are his thoughts on the Islamophobia rampant throughout France and their issue of terrorism related to people possessing extreme views of or misunderstandings of Islam?
Yeah, I think it's a really careless and it's a reckless response, and it's really unfortunate to see leaders of such powerful nations fan the flames of division and of bigotry and making people out to be scapegoats to engage in fear mongering. It's really pathetic. And it's like the oldest trick in the political book. If something else is not going right in a given society, let's create a new boogeyman. Let's create, well, in this case with France, I mean, this has been going on for quite some time, but it seemed to have gone away a little bit. And now all of a sudden he's we're back to like ISIS days where people are talking about radical Islam. And France has many different types of radicalisms, but we don't often hear about them via President Macron. He's only focusing on one form of radicalism. And when this is the only form of radicalism that you're hearing about in the media, that marginalizes people. When people start thinking of religious radicalism or violence or terrorism, they're going to start thinking about a given group of people. And we saw this kind of ramification play out in the days following what happened to the school teacher. May God rest his soul. We saw two hijabi women. I think it was outside. It might have been right by the Eiffel Tower, but they were stabbed for looking Muslim, for being Muslim. Where did these two people who actually, where did the stabber come up with this idea or knowledge about who these people were? So Macron is not being constructive at all. And it's, I also want to be fair to him. Like, will he receive backlash for some of his comments about communities living in pockets, and like not wanting to integrate? Is that true? It might be, but it's not generally true. It's the same with any given community. Are there blights on the Irish American community, the Italian American community? Yeah, there's some problems within these communities, but we don't see politicians generalizing all Italians as being part of the mob or the mafia. So our leaders need to do a much better job. And let me end by saying this: like Macron, if he was serious about really moving forward somehow, instead of just lashing out, he should sit down with leaders in these communities who happen to be Muslim and say, hey, this is our concern. We want to solve it. How can we all work together to do it? But it seems like everyone is just saying with Macron, like he just came out of nowhere with this and just started saying things that were rash and sensational.
I think we've touched on some very, very important points here, because we've addressed the idea that these issues are not current. First of all, they have a deep-rooted historical nature, and they have sort of been bubbling on the surface for a while. And the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015 and various other attacks which have taken place throughout the Western world, there has been an issue of tackling extremism, not only by Muslims, but by people of other religious factions as well, like the Christchurch attacks in New Zealand. And the response has to be very, very careful. And I think that you're completely right in criticizing the response of the French President Macron, because he has been approaching this from a means of trying to alienate and other the Muslim population within France even more. And through creating discourse and creating open dialogue, we can actually address these issues in a much more positive and fruitful, effective way. The next question I would like to ask you is actually linked onto the Clash of Civilizations, an approach which you mention in your book that you completely disagree with. You think that actually Western values and Islamic values are a lot more compatible than people realize. And the fact that French presidents or other people in the past have actually tried to represent them as polar opposites, this is completely misinterpreting what the true heart of Islam is. Islam stands for equality, for justice, for fairness, for pluralism. And so if you could please tell us a bit about what your thought is of this deep-rooted historical idea of Clash of Civilizations and Islam being generally incompatible with the West.
So I'll say this: I think the best of Islamic values and the best of Western values are compatible, without a doubt. They align. And it really goes back to what I mentioned earlier with this vision of a world order which is open, egalitarian, provides fundamental rights like freedom of worship, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the right to own property, the right to be involved in your government, religious tolerance, the rule of law. I think all of these things, when you go back to the the time of Prophet Muhammad, and then you fast forward and you're in the 18th century and you look at what the founding fathers of the United States were talking about, there are a lot of similarities there, which raises an interesting question, like whose values are they? Like we shouldn't get into a game. It's like, oh, well, there's Muslims did it first, so these are really Islamic values. That's not really kind of what it's about. It's more about how civilizations develop, and in the American context, you had someone like Thomas Jefferson, who was really a controversial figure, but he was a scholar, and he had an extensive library. And I'm sure many of the viewers know that he owned a copy of the Quran that was interpreted and translated by an Englishman named George Sale. And Jefferson was probably really curious. I think he was a lawyer. He was probably curious in the Sharia and like trying to figure out how did Muhammad and how does the Islamic tradition approach the rule of law in a society? How does it approach governance? So it raises interesting questions about how civilizations are basically built on previous waves of civilizations, so like when we look at the Clash, which has really been beaten up so much now, it's barely still breathing, but it assumes that civilizations are real things. Like when we talk about Western civilization, I mean, it's so diverse and it's so multifaceted, it's hard to really even argue that such a thing exists, right? So he's painting civilizations as monoliths, where it's much better to look at, in my opinion, the dialogue of civilizations, which is the interaction culturally, socially, politically, religiously of these so-called civilizations. And this is something that Pope Francis has advocated for, which I support. But in a future book, I'm actually writing as part of my thesis this idea of the synthesis of civilizations, which is really linked to the sociological concept of hybridity. Whereas like you have these different nations coming together and they're not only in dialogue with one another, they're creating something new together, where these values that we're talking about kind of blend into one. And this perceived division between Islam and the West kind of blends away. And I talk about this in the 4th chapter of the book when I look at Andalusia and Sicily. People forget the glorious history of Christian-Muslim relations and civilization itself in Sicily. So Huntington, he's no longer here on Earth, but he would have, I think, a hard time of defending his thesis.
Yes, of course. It is much more complicated when you look at civilizations. They aren't enclosed entities that exist within themselves. There is so much hybridity, so much geographical connectivity, so much travel, migration, and plurality, which is one of the main topics of discussion in this podcast today. I guess the next step within this podcast would be to talk to you about what you think can actually help us. What are what would you say would be one of the main solutions to actually change people's mindsets, whether they're following Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, whether they are listening to these big media conglomerates and adopting and instilling more Islamophobic or anti-Semitic viewpoints and becoming more religiously intolerant, which is unfortunately something we are seeing throughout not only the Western world, but also in India, in Myanmar, in various other countries, in China. So would you say that actually adopting this approach that you use of interfaith activism could be perhaps one of the most viable solutions to tackling such Islamophobia or such religious intolerance in general?
Absolutely. Interfaith activism is certainly powerful when it comes to overcoming Islamophobia and other forms of religious tolerance. It's definitely part of the solution. If we were to package this solution together, basically, trying to answer the question, how do we go about tackling Islamophobia? Interfaith activism is 100% part of it. And in addition to, like changing media narratives, having more Muslims involved in politics so they can kind of control their own narrative and so on. But I know for me personally, interfaith activism and exposure and having experiences with real people rather than people that I see on the TV has just been so so warming as a human. But I think as someone who engages in scholarship, it's been really important in terms of identifying the best ways forward. And, you know, when we talk about tackling Islamophobia, I think a lot of people like to start at the macro level. You know, they may start with, let's take the French context, like making criticism of Prophet Muhammad hate speech. You know, that is asking a lot. And that's also really complicated because you have to go through politicians and you have to, you know, advocate for that. But I like to, as a sociologist and as an interfaith activist myself, I suppose, I really like to start at the very micro level with everyday individual encounters between groups of people. You know, so this is like spending time in people's homes, places of worship, schools, businesses, you know, like genuinely becoming friends with people. And I think there are few things more powerful than a good story. Like, forget a story in a book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, a story that you experienced, that you were involved in. And I'll give you an example. Like, I was given a talk in Kingwood, Texas years ago. And I went to this church like three falls in a row, and I was giving talks to a Christian community, pretty conservative Christian community. And I was speaking about how Islamophobia and groups like ISIS are two sides of the same coin. So they have like the same kind of understanding of the West and of Islam. And within 2 minutes of talking, someone stood up in the back. And this person was going on about how Muslims are just not good people and like they hate us and everything. And what I just simply did, I shared with him a story, one story of a Muslim man who was so kind to pay for my medical bills when I had an allergic reaction to peanuts in California. I didn't have any health insurance at the time. And the man who was hosting me was such a gentleman that he actually covered my bill because he believed in what I was standing for and he believed in what I was doing. You know, I mean, when you have and that's just one of countless stories, examples. When you have real life encounters like that, it can really bust a stereotype. And we need more of these encounters. It takes a lot of kind of courage to get out of your comfort zone and meet people that you think don't like you. It's hard.
It's definitely very eye-opening to see the fact that we do spend a lot of time focusing on the macro level and talking about these massive historical structures or legal structures or the media outlets, and we should actually also focus on the micro level and the fact that your interfaith activism has enabled you to meet so many Muslims from various places throughout the world and really engage with them, learn from them, enjoy life's experiences with them. It changes the perspective completely. And that's why Minhaj Welfare Foundation and Minhaj Al-Quran International also focus heavily on interfaith activities in order to understand the Christian community, in order to understand the Jewish community and various other religious communities, in order to create better connections, to create community ties, in order to create an integrated and harmonious society which fights for justice, which is a common cause, fights for religious plurality and tolerance and equality of religious speech and of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is currently a very big topic within France and throughout the Western world and throughout the globe, because of the terrorist attack which took place in France. And I think something that's very important is to actually speak about freedom of speech in the light of Islam. And many Muslims are completely open to freedom of speech because of the teachings of Prophet Muhammad. If we look at a case where the Christians of Najran visited Prophet Muhammad in his mosque in Medina, and they openly engaged in theological dialogue. They spoke about governance and politics and differences in beliefs, and Prophet Muhammad encouraged this dialogue. There was so much freedom of speech, freedom to discuss your religious differences openly and with respect and harmony. And so many Muslims throughout the world are completely on board with freedom of speech. However, there are certain boundaries, and I guess I would like to pass the discussion over to Dr. Considine to figure out what his thoughts are on freedom of speech in the light of Islam.
Yeah, so this is, it feels like, in terms of the scholarship, and even today, like this is an issue that has really been discussed and contemplated by scholars and Muslims since, time immemorial, really, 632. And put it this way, like, I think that there is data knowledge to justify both positions. And this is always a quarrel. And I think it really gets to a deeper issue of how do we want to interpret things? Like, do we want to imagine freedom of speech as part of the Islamic value system? I think if that is a question, like, can we imagine it? Yes, you definitely can. And I think one of the prime examples would be maybe two examples. One, the Christians of Najran visiting Prophet Muhammad and the Ummah in the year 630 inside Masjid al-Nabawi. They are having conversations about Christology, which is a really sensitive subject for both parties involved, the Christians of Najran and Muhammad and the believers. And, according to a very conservative understanding of Islam, a lot of the stuff that the Christians were saying was basically blaspheming against Jesus. And the historical sources don't say anything about Muhammad preventing the Christians from openly sharing their mind and sharing their views and their belief. So yeah, there are examples, and I'm more familiar with the examples that do provide this opportunity to imagine freedom of speech as part of the Islamic value system. And I just find that an issue like this gets to something deeper, which is like, why do people want to find the examples of freedom of speech not being part of the Ummah or part of the Islamic value system? It's like one of these things, like we have a choice, really, because there's data to prove both points. It's another thing, like, why do some people only focus on the negative attributes of other groups of people when there are positive attributes? Like, why do us as humans have this nature where we focus on the negative things, the things that divide us? What is really going on here? And I think in the current context, the freedom of speech debate is really, it's adding further flame to the fire, because you have a lot of communities who happen to be Muslim in various parts of Europe who are angry and who are marginalized, I'm sure. And when they see the head of state defending, maybe not directly, but indirectly, these cartoons, which are just useless. They're just, they're caricatures of something and of someone who means so much to people. They see that as just another kind of tick in the Islamophobic box, if you want to say it. So, it's a challenge. Personally, I am for freedom of speech, for sure, even if it's ridiculous. But I guess that's a story for another day. I just think it's a slippery slope when you start legislating speech and what can be said. I just wish people were more productive with their speech. And, like, why do this? Just to tick people off, draw a cartoon, I mean, of Muhammad, like just to anger people, like that's not healthy. That's not constructive.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that it's definitely a slippery slope. And where do we draw the parameters and the boundaries of freedom of speech? Because it certainly is something that the Muslim community stands for. However, in this case, where, as you said, there's mockery, there's ridicule of something that is so dear to Muslims, the legacy of Prophet Muhammad, it's something we hold very dear to our hearts. We aim to follow the footsteps of the Holy Prophet and embed his teachings within our lives. And so because of that love, there will of course be a certain amount of offense and even sorrow when we see situations such as this, where in France they are highlighting the caricatures on French governmental buildings at the moment. And so, like you said, it's a slippery slope, and we do need to be more productive with our language rather than reacting. We need to respond, and we do need to respond with education and aim to raise awareness about why certain religious communities may hold certain aspects of their faith so dear to their heart, and why they may incite such emotion within people. So yes, I think, again, coming back to interfaith activism, it's a key source of creating that connection, that understanding and empathy, which will hopefully lead to real change within the people, within the way that people understand those of other religious communities. Another point I would like to touch on is, since we are talking about Prophet Muhammad's legacy and his teachings, and a big part of his humanitarian work was also linked onto racism, and he hoped to tackle racism, and this is mentioned through his own teachings, the way he treated people such as Bilal from his community, and also the way in which such statements occur within the Quran, where it's blatantly stated that there is no white person who is more superior to a black person, and vice versa. And so if we just take a look at the current situation with America and the structural racism, I mean, would you say that in fact there is something that perhaps people could learn from the legacy of Prophet Muhammad, and the fact that so many years ago, 1,400 years ago, he spoke up against racism and he took an anti-racist stance, and we are still suffering from these problems within our present day contemporary society, where we cannot guarantee that black people, white people, and people of all other ethnic orientations will be treated equally.
So, yeah, Muhammad's views on racial equality, it's one of the reasons why I admire his life and legacy, because his teachings and his principles and his values are directly related to what's happening today. And they're directly related, I think, to the solutions to some of the problems we're seeing today. And when we look at his journey, his life journey, and when we look at his views on a subject like racial equality, I think we really need to start with him being a prophet, him receiving revelations from God, who really created all human beings as human beings first and foremost. And he created us as equal. And I believe there's a verse in the Quran, I can't remember exactly the chapter and the verse, but it says something like, God is speaking. He's saying, we created you into nations and tribes for you to get to know one another, for you to understand one another. And, that's racism is God's ultimate test for humans. He's basically saying, well, yep, I created all of you from Adam and Eve, and I'm making you equal. And then I'm going to throw in this wrinkle. And this is going to be, people looking differently, people coming from different families and ethnicities and races. And then this is the ultimate test. And when Muhammad comes into the world, and you look at 7th century or 6th century Meccan society, we see a environment that is hyper tribal. hyper-tribal in the sense that one's sense of belonging in a given community was really predicated on blood, ancestry, lineage, which is not necessarily, I think, the best way about going about organizing a given society. So Muhammad is coming with a revolutionary message, really, which is the oneness of humanity, the oneness of people, and that people deserve fundamental rights and dignity, and they deserve respect for the simple fact that they're human alone and no other reason. And when we look at some of the actions that he actually embarked upon during his life, which separates him from being merely a non-racist, and I talk about this in the book. Hopefully everyone listening here is a non-racist person, which is essentially someone that does not believe in the inferiority of the people and of the races. And this idea that stereotypes are stereotypes and that they do not reflect on a person's true character and conduct. Hopefully everyone is like that. That's like the bare minimum. But Muhammad not only believed that and understood that through the revelations from God, but he also took active measures to help dismantle the institutional racism and also the micro, racism that we saw at an everyday level. So he's being an anti-racist in this regard. So he's taking measures. And I look at several stories. I think the classic case is the relationship that he had with Bilal ibn Rabah, the Abyssinian slave who looked differently from all of the, the majority of the people in Mecca, of the Quraysh. He was darker. He was African. And Muhammad and Abu Bakr not only freed him, literally buying someone's freedom, but also allowed him to rise in the rank of the early Ummah into the position of the Muezzin, right? So he's not only freeing him, but he's saying, hey, you're going to get what you deserve. You're a brilliant leader, and this is the role that you're going to have in community. So he's allowing people to be socially mobile. And then I don't talk about this in the anti-racism chapter, but I think the Constitution of Medina is itself an anti-racist act, creating a civic nation, creating a nation in which one's sense of belonging is no longer predicated on race, ethnicity, or tribe. It's predicated on a set of laws, a set of principles. And then, of course, in his farewell sermon, and I talk about this in the book, and I love this example because it's almost like holding a mirror to two different moments in history. So Muhammad, towards the end of his life, one of the last things that he wanted to stress to his people was this idea of racial equality. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing, an Arab has no superiority over non-Arab, black has no superiority over a non-black, white doesn't have any superiority over a non-white except in piety and in good action, right? So kind of driving home this point that the things that really matter about a person is what's inside, not how they look or necessarily where they're from. And you fast forward to 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. giving his iconic I Have a Dream speech in 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And he says something almost identical. He says, again, paraphrasing, I hope that one day my 4 children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And here we are, Muhammad saying this in 632. He's from Mecca, he's a Muslim, and he's an Arab. And then Dr. King, African-American, Christian, and an American. So interesting parallel that we have. And certainly Muhammad's teachings are relevant.
I think one of the last aspects of this discussion I would like to touch on is the fact that there are so many similarities between people of the monotheistic faith, something that you said right in the beginning. And it's important to focus on those similarities, and it's perhaps a time to move away from our differences, embrace our similarities and celebrate them, and to be a support system for one another, to continue to build bridges and to continue to show love, compassion and mercy to one another, because in truth, these are the teachings, the values of all of the faiths, the Abrahamic faiths.
Yeah, and this is bringing us back to something that I kind of touched upon earlier. And let me just say this, like the similarities exist, like they're so well documented. My scholarship is not necessarily bringing anything revolutionary to the plate when we talk about the similarities between Jesus and Muhammad. They're very similar. So, the question, should we focus more on our similarities and than our differences? There's no question. And it really alerts us to this idea that we have a choice to do what we want with the knowledge that we have. And it brings us to a deeper question, like why would we focus on issues that could potentially divide us? What is preventing people from seeing Jesus and Muhammad in an equal light, in the same light? Like what? It's like almost like a spiritual. It's a spiritual crisis, really, in many ways. The trend that we see of people seeking division and actually kind of condoning it and actually liking it, like wanting a separation between themselves and their communities and other people. What explains that? Jesus and Muhammad were two individuals who were involved in a process of getting the periphery of society back into the fold. Muhammad is talking about the importance of taking care of orphans and freeing slaves and treating women the right way. And Jesus, if you read the Gospels, is doing something quite similar, taking the outcast, the people that no one wants to deal with anymore. This was the project that they were embarking upon. And, we would be wise if, Christians and Muslims respectively followed the life and the legacy of their leaders, rather than getting into debates about Jesus's divinity or Prophet Muhammad's and the Quran's views on Jesus. We have an option. What do we want to do? Do we want to be constructive or do we want to be destructive? That's the bigger question, I think.
I think that's perfectly true. Like, we do need to focus on our similarities more. We do need to focus on creating a community that is cohesive and bound in intellectual dialogue and openness and freedom. We need to allow one another to express ourselves and to follow the path that we choose, because this, in actuality, is the teaching of the Quran. There is no compulsion in religion, and this is the teaching and the legacy of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, as well. I would just like to thank you, Dr. Considine, for coming on this podcast, for sharing his wisdom with us, and for shedding light on such important matters, and for also becoming a beacon of hope for so many people who are trying to create greater connection and greater compassion and trying to tackle Islamophobia or religious intolerance. So thank you again to Dr. Considine for coming on this.
Thank you so much. Hey, I think we did a really good job of pulling this off. This is the first time this has happened. It must be something with the StreamYard, because this has never happened before, but I'm glad we pulled it off. And I hope, I want to thank you again. It was a pleasure meeting you, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
This podcast was brought to you by Minhaj Welfare Foundation, and if you wish to see their humanitarian work taking place in the light of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's legacy and teachings, please do check out minhajwelfare.org. You can also submit your donations via the site. And you were listening to the podcast series Muhammad the Humanitarian. I was your host, Anam Iqbal, and joining me was Dr. Craig Considine. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, wa alaikum assalam.
Allahumma salli ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammadin. Allah